welcome to today's episode of Daily Debrief, your primer to international news, brought to you by People's Dispatch. I'm Swastika, and let's head into our first story. The United States has added the NSO Group, which makes the controversial Pegasus software, on a list of restricted companies or blacklist. This means that exports to the US from them are limited. This is the latest stage in the months-long series of global actions against the company after the media revelations that showed it could have been used to spy on activists and journalists. Now, we have with us Prashant in our studio.
Hello.
Thank you, Prashant, for joining us today. Could you tell us, now that we know that USA is Israel's ally and it has blacklisted NSO, does it mean it spells trouble for NSO?
Well, one would definitely hope so, but actually it remains to be seen, because the fact also lies in that the United States, for instance, was not really affected by so much by the NSO issue. So it's interesting, there are even people who speculated that maybe it was US interests which led to this news coming out in the first place, but keep that aside. So the basic fact, of course, is that the Pegasus software, or spyware actually, it's more accurate, was likely to have been implanted in the phones of a lot of people across the world, thousands of people. We have journalists, we have political leaders, we have activists, we have scholars, we have even actually normal people who are around prominent people. Even their phones may have been infected. And it's a very, very powerful spyware, which means that you don't need to click on anything to be infected. And that spyware can basically capture all your, all the data on the phone. So it's not even only like phone tapping or whatever. So it's probably the next level of spyware that is being used. So on the one hand, this, yes, of course, indicates there's a symbolic element to it. In fact, other countries have also, launched investigations, launched probes. One country which has maybe gone the other direction is Morocco, who has been accused of targeting a lot of people, and now they have filed a complaint in a French court saying against the media organizations which wrote about it.
Okay.
So that's an outlier. But actually, it remains to be seen if because of this, the company is going to suffer. It's probably unlikely. On the other hand, what is likely to happen is the fact that I think, if countries, for instance, have stronger regulatory mechanisms, which is really the key issue here, if they have regulatory mechanisms, these countries are likely to activate them in order to be a bit more, careful. Because one of the most insidious things about this Pegasus spyware is that you don't have to be anybody prominent. You don't have to do anything even to get targeted by it. There's no transparency. Now, the NSO Group, which manufactures Pegasus, says that only government agencies are allowed to use this, or government agencies are sold the Pegasus spyware, right? So what this means is that all this targeting may have been done by government agencies. So the real hope is in the fact that actually there are regulatory mechanisms in all these countries which will investigate this issue, expose the fact that it was used. For instance, there are reports that Jamal Khashoggi, was targeted before he was with spyware before he was murdered.
Yes.
And we don't know how many other cases there are, and how many lives have been affected and what kind of impact. So there has to be a lot of transparency on this, and there has to be proper regulatory investigations into this, and these investigations have to come out. Other than that, just a blacklist may not necessarily affect this company so much, because we know that it has ties to Israeli intelligence, and Israeli intelligence definitely has ties to the US intelligence as well. So it's an open question as to whether this measure is going to really affect it. I think if this company has to be affected, it has to be through a series of global regulatory actions.
In fact, one of the other developments that came out from the Pegasus software was from India. If you could tell us more about what really transpired in this country.
Right, India is a very good example of how this issue should not be handled, maybe, because what happened was, when the revelations came out that Indian journalists, Indian activists had been targeted with the spyware, the government refused to give a proper response. Now, this issue came up in Parliament. It was covered by a lot of Indian media organizations. It was not that nobody knew about it. But the government categorically refused to give a proper answer, except generally saying that nothing illegal has happened. Now, that does not really solve your problem, because it is possible that legally surveillance could be undertaken, but which is not a good thing, right? It could be legal in the sense it could be procedural, but that does not mean it should have been done. So there was no real answer to that. The Supreme Court, some of the people who were affected, including journalists, took this matter to the Supreme Court of India. Yet again, there the government preferred to use the argument of national security, which is, I think, what many governments have chosen when confronted with this issue. That, this is a national security issue, so we cannot talk about this in public. and we cannot reveal if Pegasus has been used against people. So now the court refused to buy this argument, and it very clearly delineated this aspect. It said, see, there are national security angles which we don't want you to talk about, but there is a question that remains to be answered, which is that have common citizens been spied upon using the spyware? What was the process, etc. And now they set up an independent committee to inquire. So I think in a few weeks we'll see those reports. Now, once all those reports, will this committee have the freedom to actually do all the investigation it wants to do? What will the results be? All that remains to be seen. But nonetheless, it's a largely positive development, so to speak. Of course, there's one section of critics who have pointed out that there was perhaps even no need for a committee. All that was needed was for the court to ask a direct question to the government. Have civilians, been targeted with this, for instance? We're not talking about, military installations or foreign agents or whatever. That's not the question here. Have civilians, including journalists and activists, been targeted with this spyware? And in India, if you look at the list of names who are cited as possible targets, let's be clear, it's still possible targets. It's a wide variety of people stretching across the spectrum. Like I said, journalists, activists, people, associates of political leaders, people like security guards or, friends of political leaders who have all been targeted because the spyware's recording capacity is so amazing that amazing is in quotes, that just if an infected phone is around you, that's enough to tap all your information, right? So it's not so, like many have pointed out, your phone becomes a spy. Your own personal phone where you make calls, where you take photos, where you talk with your loved ones becomes a spy to be used against you. So I think this is a positive step. Hopefully the committee comes up with proper answers which can satisfy the Indian people. If it does, it'll also be a major step in the global scenario as well.
So we have to see what this committee now decides, and we'll stay with this story. Thank you for being with us. Going on to our next story, we stay on with Israel, where its forces stormed the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem yet again on Thursday in what has become a regular occurrence. The police reportedly entered the Dome of the Rock and prevented some maintenance work. This is in addition to over 100 Jewish Israelis storming the premises on the same day. Actually, Prashant, we'll come back to you on this as well. We have heard of many such incidents. Now, what makes Al-Aqsa a flashpoint?
Right, Swastika. So the issue fundamentally is you're talking about Jerusalem. Jerusalem, one of the historic cities of the world. A lot of war has been waged over Jerusalem for hundreds of years. It's a holy city to Muslims, Christians, Jews, and there are a lot of temples, mosques, churches, etc. So what we're talking about is the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is the third holiest site in Islam, right? And right next to it is also the Western Wall of the Temple Mount, which is a holy site for the Jews as well. Now, there are laws in place, there are precedents in place which clearly state that as far as the Al-Aqsa Mosque is concerned and the mosque compound is concerned, because the area is generally considered holy by a lot of people, Jews, for instance, are allowed to visit that area, but they cannot pray. They are allowed to pray in what is called the Western Wall, which is close by, but they cannot pray in the Al-Aqsa compound itself. The Al-Aqsa compound itself, prayer rights are exclusively reserved for the Muslims. What has been happening over the past many years, and let's be clear, it's many years, is that time and again, Israeli settlers, Jewish settlers have basically invaded the compound, this Al-Aqsa compound. They have staged prayers over there. They have, gotten into scuffles with, Palestinians who are praying over there, Palestinian Muslims who are praying over there. Israeli security forces have time and again taken side of these settlers, cracked down on the people who are praying there, made arrests, for instance. The most notable instance in recent times took place in May, when time and again such attacks took place on people who were praying in Al-Aqsa Mosque. That was actually a catalyst, because following that, in protest, incendiary balloons were sent from Gaza, and Israel then used that as an excuse to sort of bomb Gaza for 10 days. So, around that time, multiple incidents were happening. There were multiple attacks at Al-Aqsa Mosque. There was the Sheikh Jarrah expulsions, where the people were at risk of being expelled. So, and when incendiary balloons were sent, Israel used this as a great opportunity to attack Gaza left, right, and center. So, this is a long history of this. For instance, I remember, I think in October 2019, there were at least 4 instances of such attacks on this thing. So, this has become kind of an everyday occurrence almost, that people keep, the Israeli security forces keep allowing settlers to enter. In this case, of course, it's the police themselves, but often it's a combination of the two. First, the settlers are allowed to, rush in, pray, sometimes make comments, whatever, And when some of the worshippers get irritated, Muslim worshippers get irritated or they resist, then the police come in and say, you are causing a problem, and then, attack the, Palestinian Muslims as well. So that's really the pattern that has emerged over here. And this is part of a, larger plan actually to sort of turn this into a much more conflict zone. So basically, attack the rights of Palestinians.
Actually, then it also, I have another question. What are the Israeli settlers who are organizing these attacks? What are they seeking to get at?
So that's where it boils down to the larger question, which is that there are various sections of settlers who are indulging in such activities. At least one section, the most extreme section, actually demands the demolition of the Al-Aqsa Mosque.
Okay.
And they believe that that whole area is a site of an ancient Jewish temple which was destroyed during the Roman Empire, and they want a Jewish temple to be built in its place. Now that's the most extreme section, and they are some of the most virulent attackers when it takes place. So they are also among the sections which actually enter the Al-Aqsa compound and make it a point to pray there, right? Although that this is despite the fact that this is against the rules. In fact, recently there was an incident in October, I believe, when it was permitted. And then a court actually reiterated the fact that a Jewish person cannot pray over them. Yeah. But the larger plan here, as far as the Israelis are concerned, is basically to erase the culture and history of the Palestinian people, especially with regard to the Al-Aqsa Mosque. So what they want to sort of try to prove is that basically Palestine and Israel, what is Israel today, which is the occupied territories, are all, basically the homeland of the Jews. And the Palestinians who have lived there for centuries actually do not belong there. So that's the narrative that they're trying to build, that, by, for instance, saying that, trying to say Al-Aqsa should be destroyed and the Jewish temple be built. What they're trying to basically say is the Palestinians are the outsiders over here, so they can be treated as second-class citizens. Whereas, obviously, as anybody who's seen the history knows, there is a long history of Palestinians, Christians, Palestinian Muslims, Palestinian Christians, Jews, Muslims, from all communities coexisting in that region. And this is an idea which Israel cannot accept, because Israel is increasingly turning into a country which focuses on Jewish supremacy, right? So according to them, the Jewish community is the only true community of Israel. That's what many sections believe. And some of these sections are in political power also. So what we're seeing right now really is a concerted attempt by some sections, which is very strongly supported by the government, let's be clear. So it's not that the extreme sections which are saying that the mosque should be demolished are completely isolated. There is tacit support at various levels as well. So the government officials may not say they demolish the mosque, but they're willing to turn a blind eye to the activities of people who do that. So that's really the danger here. And it's we've talked about a lot of issues regarding Palestine on this. So the other aspect, of course, also is the fact that the occupation of the whole of Jerusalem is a key aspect of what Israel wants to ensure. Israel wants to take over Jerusalem continuously. This is part of that as well, remove the Palestinians from that area. And that is what we're seeing in the Sheikh Jarrah issue as well. So there is it's a concerted plan in various ways. And this is one aspect of that plan, or to attack the rights and identity of Palestinians as a whole.
We'll keep coming back to this, Prashant, because this will continue to stay as a hotbed for many other such incidents that will take place up ahead as well. Thank you. Now, moving on to our next story. We move to COVID-related issues, namely vaccine mandates. Now, vaccine mandates are when governments or employers declare that you need to be vaccinated or get tested before you're allowed to go to a particular place or work somewhere. Such mandates are being imposed in various countries across the world, and there has been a lot of debate and even some protests. So how are these mandates used as a public health measure? Who should ideally be in a position to impose them? Immunologist Dr. Satyajit Rath explains.
This is not as straightforward a question as it appears at first glance, because the idea of vaccine mandates is not a single idea, but is actually a whole cluster of ideas. Should employers demand that their employees be vaccinated? Should they offer exemption clauses such as weekly or even daily testing as alternatives? That's one way of looking at vaccine mandates. Vaccine passports, on the other hand, where you cannot travel, you cannot do this, that, and the other, you cannot live as a citizen without vaccination, where your life is affected in very large-scale fashion, is another way of looking at vaccine mandates. The core difference is is the agency and or the authority which is imposing vaccine mandates providing vaccination opportunity or not? And I do not see how a mandate can be imposed by an authority without providing vaccinations. That said, are they an advisable public health measure? Let's look at it this way. Vaccination, especially in pandemic times, is an advisable public health measure. Should everybody be vaccinated? As far as possible, yes, from the point of view of public health measure. Why? Because vaccinations provide protection of the individual from severe illness and disease in the COVID context. Vaccinations reduce to a certain extent, however modestly, the magnitude and the duration of transmission of infection, and therefore reduces the burden on the public health system of the pandemic. Vaccinations will therefore slow the spread of the infection down. And therefore, both in the individual and the collective context, vaccinations are an advisable public health measure in the COVID pandemic. That, I repeat, is a different context from the other way of posing the question, which is, are there certain contexts and situations, countries, where it might be a good idea to impose a vaccine mandate and others where it might not be optimum? And I go back to the point I made that if authorities, whether they are private sector authorities such as employers imposing a mandate or public sector government authorities imposing mandates of a variety of kinds, mandates are advisable and appropriate provided everybody affected by the mandate is being offered vaccination by the imposing authority. When we think about vaccine hesitancy or vaccine skepticism in COVID times, it's important to distinguish right-wing, anti-science, majoritarian, xenophobic, ideological underpinnings of vaccine hesitancy from the vaccine hesitancy seen in subaltern, marginalized, disempowered, disenfranchised communities and groups, where the state and the apparatus of the state is quite frequently known as representing elite exploitation. So that distinction is absolutely crucial to keep in mind. We can address collectively the vaccine hesitancy seen in subaltern communities by honest community engagement, by transparency, by providing the support that is needed for people from these communities to get vaccinated with ease and comfort. So the approach to addressing subaltern vaccine hesitancy involves rational, logical, transparent science. The approach to handling the vaccine hesitancy driven by anti-science xenophobic ideologies is a whole different category of problems altogether.
And finally, the people of Lebanon are not amused after a new tourism slogan was coined for the country. The crisis-hit Lebanese apparently have not warmed up to "We love you in your madness," which is the new slogan. Prashant, not a very catchy slogan there.
I don't know. I actually think it's quite catchy. It's just that it's probably the wrong place at the wrong time, because we know that Lebanon is going through a lot at this point, and there's ethnic tensions which are being created by the far right. The United States and Israel, we keep coming back to these two countries, but they're mounting a massive pressure campaign against the people of Lebanon. Power cuts, huge power cuts. There were fuel supply and fuel and oil shortages recently as well, issues of food. And in between all this, it's not surprising if celebrating madness seems a bit too much for the people of the country.
Also your madness.
Exactly. So the attempt apparently was that, to tap into the fact of tap into Lebanese culture, hospitality, that spirit of seize the day or whatever. But clearly, a lot of people, in fact, even the prime minister seems to have been slightly put off by the comments and blamed it on previous administrations, the madness that is. So clearly, when the tourism minister and the company which actually coined the slogan said madness, they were thinking of a very different madness. Yeah. Sadly, a lot of people seem to have identified it with the current, difficult situation that's going on over there. So, like I said, I mean, I conceptually, I think it's a nice concept, but probably not what
right time.
What people really want. It's a bit tone deaf, for lack of better words. So, I'm using how, and this was done for free, by the way. So, so probably, I mean, it's fascinating how some of these things just, at the end of the day, branding and marketing can really be a difficult game. What sounds nice in paper turns out to be very, very, turns out to be completely out of sync with the mood of the people of that time. So, interesting question.
Well, Lebanon is in a somber mood. It is in the middle of a lot of crisis. So, well, that's all we have for today. Keep watching us and do follow us on People's Dispatch.